Well, hey everybody, Alex here, and thanks for stopping by the channel. Gonna do something a little different today. Gonna put together a video all about collecting autographed baseballs. I started collecting autographed baseballs over 3 years ago, and in that initial kind of excitement of getting into that hobby, I definitely went on YouTube and watched a lot of different videos, but had to kind of piece together information on how to go about collecting autographed baseballs. And so I've had a few people ask me a couple questions in the past couple months and thought, you know what, I'll go ahead and try to put a video together and share my thoughts and opinions and just the general ways that I go about putting my collection together. One of the first things I want to say is that I am by no means an expert in this, just to make that clear, but I have been collecting baseballs for over 3 years, as I mentioned, and I currently have around 60 baseballs in my collection. So I'm not an expert, but I definitely have some experience, and I've made some mistakes, and I've learned some things, and so I'm hoping that this can at least start a conversation and get some people thinking about it. You know, if you're on the fence about collecting baseballs, maybe you've thought about it, maybe you have a couple, and you've thought about getting a couple others, what you should know is that collecting baseballs is fun. It's really fun. To be honest with you, there really isn't anything out there that's quite like holding a baseball that was signed by your favorite player, or a baseball that was actually used in a game, or maybe best of all, a baseball that was signed by one of the all-time greats, like say Mickey Mantle or Ted Williams. You know, it's a hobby and it's a collectible, but for me, in a real way, I kind of feel like some of these things are artifacts, especially the vintage baseballs. They really are like little pieces of history. And that, I know that kind of sounds a little over the top, but it really can transport you back to a time even before you were born and make the history of baseball a real tangible thing that you can hold in your hand. That is just not the same as reading about it or talking about it. You know, that kind of thing is great, but there's nothing quite like having that piece of history. It's just a really cool thing. All right, so while baseballs are really fun to collect, they will also quickly eat up a ton of space if you don't have a particular focus. Now, for some of you out there, that might not be a problem. You might have a lot of space, and maybe you have enough space to have a never-ending wall of baseballs that fill up your house. And if that's your thing, look, I can totally appreciate that, and I'm going to be jealous of you because I can't do that. But when you get to a point where you can't even remember what you have and what you don't have, that's where you may have gone too far, in my opinion. So what I like to try to do is keep myself in check, because if I don't, I'm soon going to be drowning in baseballs. And worse than that, the whole hobby is going to get ruined in a way. I think it's going to lose its appeal because I'm just going to be buying stuff to buy stuff. It's supposed to be fun, but I really don't want it to become an addiction. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. My collection initially started out focused mainly on my all-time favorite Philadelphia Phillies players. So Hall of Famers and star players, but also just players that I grew up admiring that were key contributors over the years for the Phillies, but they weren't necessarily household names or superstars or anything like that. So that was a lot of fun. It got me started, and, you know, I had names right off the bat that just, you know, popped in my head that I knew I wanted to collect. But at a certain point, that well kind of ran dry. I mean, I'll still occasionally add a new Phillies player now and then that I don't already have, but I also didn't want to start collecting random players that really weren't on my list and that I don't really care about just to keep collecting baseballs. And so what happened was that collecting focus kind of ran its course. My focus has really shifted. It's become what I'm calling big-time pitchers, and that's based in part on this book that I recently read called K, A History of Baseball in 10 Pitches, which is a really awesome book, by the way, and if you haven't heard of it, you haven't picked it up, you should definitely get it. You know, collecting aside, it's an incredible book that takes you through all the different types of pitches and the history and all the different guys that were key contributors to that pitch. So I definitely recommend that book. That book, as I was reading it, really kind of triggered an idea to focus on pitchers and to go for autographed baseballs of some of the best pitchers in baseball history. And it does so many things in terms of my collecting habit. It involves a wealth of interesting players from all eras of the game. I'm not going to collect every Hall of Fame pitcher or every big name pitcher, but I'm going to go for the ones that I'm interested in or the ones that I respond to in terms of their story and their history. Some are going to be easier to come across than others. Some are going to be more expensive than others. And that means it's going to be a collection that will take me years to build, and I'll probably never really finish it. But it's not going to be terribly massive because I'm going to be picky, I'm going to be selective, and it will be something I can continue to work on over time. So that's the idea. Find something interesting to you that will keep you going over the years, and try to pick something that's not going to overwhelm whatever your space limitations are. Now, even though that's my focus, I should also mention that I will go for major guys like Mantle, Willie Mays, Stan Musial. Usually I try to go for their playing days. And, the playing days baseballs are going to be more expensive and harder to come across than balls that superstars might have signed later on in life. I also like to try to collect team-signed baseballs from key teams and years, but really, those are all kind of once-in-a-blue-moon purchases. I'm not really doing that often. Okay, so assuming you have some kind of focus and you're ready to go, you're going to start to make purchases. And before you make those purchases, you're going to want to do some research. Some of this stuff you're going to be able to find other people talking about, and some of this is just going to be stuff that you're going to learn on the fly. A lot of us know in any hobby that experience is going to be the best teacher, and you're going to make mistakes. Hopefully they're not going to be expensive mistakes, and you'll get better at it as you go. But there are definitely things that you want to try to avoid right off the bat. First thing you want to be aware of is the general quality of the baseball. Is it a official Major League Baseball, or was it some other kind of baseball? For example, vinyl baseballs, those are out there, and you can purchase them, and people get those signed, and those tend to be really susceptible to terrible looking signatures that get smeared or fade away very quickly, so you want to be really careful about that. I mean, you can get into the weeds here, like for example, there are certain baseballs that are prone to toning faster than other baseballs. The most famous one is the Haiti baseballs from the 1980s. Those are really susceptible to toning at a really rapid pace. Shellacked baseballs. This was a pretty common practice back in the day. People would put a varnish or a shellac onto the baseball with the intentions of preserving the signatures. Ironically, it actually had the opposite effect. The shellac would start to harden and chip away, and before you know it, the signature would be completely obliterated. So definitely something to be cautious about. Another thing you want to be aware of is what type of ink was used. Was it a Sharpie? Most people don't want their baseballs signed with Sharpies. Are there ink smears, smudges? Is the ink bleeding into the leather and then kind of diluting the signature? Is it fading away? These are all little details that you want to keep your eye open for when you're examining the baseball and deciding whether or not you want to purchase it. And these things are also going to help determine the value of the baseball. Another thing to be aware of, obviously the players can sign the baseball anywhere they want to, but from a collecting perspective, the ideal panel is the sweet spot. And the reason the sweet spot is considered the most desired panel to sign is because that's the one that is generally considered to be the best in terms of displaying the baseball. So a baseball that's signed on the sweet spot and that is centered is going to be more expensive than, say, a baseball where the player signed on the side panel or somewhere else. Some of the other factors are going to be like whether or not the player added additional inscriptions. So, for example, I've got this Steve Carlton ball. If he had just signed it Steve Carlton, the price would have been much lower than what I paid for this one, because he went to town. He signed it with all kinds of stats and figures all over the baseball. And the fact that he took that much time and that much effort to sign all those additional inscriptions means that the ball is going to be more valuable. It's going to be more pricey. Another thing to keep in mind is the actual age of the baseball itself. Generally speaking, the older the baseball and the more notable the player, the pricier the ball will get. Game-used baseballs. There are game-used baseballs going all the way back into the early 1900s, but they've really become way more prevalent, I want to say, in the last 15 years or so, because Major League Baseball has come up with a system of cataloging and authenticating game-used baseballs. So it's really become a huge part of the market. The really cool thing about it is that the authentication process allows you to know exactly which game a ball was used in, because they're all barcoded and tracked. So I've got several of those, and that's a really, really unique and cool thing, I think, to be able to have a ball signed by a pitcher, for example, and know exactly which game that ball was used in. And a lot of times they'll even put an inscription of the date or what their record was at the time or something of that nature. So it's pretty cool. Okay, so now it's time to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is authenticity. Authenticity is a huge issue in all of memorabilia, but it's especially an issue, I think, with autographs and autographed baseballs. Is it a real signature? How can I tell if it's a real signature? What do I do about this? First up, again, I'm going to say it again, you got to do your research. Study autographs. You don't have to become an expert in autographs, but you do want to have some sense of how to look at autographs and how to be able to tell whether or not what you're looking at is real or not. One good place to start would be the Hall of Fame Autographs book. This is definitely one of the first things I purchased when I got into the hobby. It's a really good resource to refer back to when you're looking at big time names that you're trying to acquire. You can become really familiar with their autographs. You can learn about how their autographs changed over the period of their life. And you can just get some really good information about, the art of understanding signatures and autographs. There's an even more recent edition of the book that came out in the past couple of years. So you should easily be able to find this book online. And I definitely recommend getting it. Beyond becoming kind of an overnight expert in autographs, the next best thing you got to do is know about authentication services. My general rule is if I'm buying a baseball and I didn't watch the player sign it, I'm going to insist on authentication. For me, PSA and JSA are the leaders in this area. Steiner is another big name in the market. Now, when it comes to authentication services, we could waste a lot of time debating how accurate one authenticator is over another, or whether or not a particular item is authentic or not, or whether or not an authenticator let a forgery slip by or something like that. But to me, all of this kind of stuff feels like reading Yelp reviews on the internet. One person's going to say that they had the worst experience ever at this restaurant, and the very next comment is a different person who said that that restaurant was the best restaurant they've ever been to and they had the best meal of their life. So, who am I supposed to believe? Whether or not, one person likes PSA or the other person doesn't like PSA, to me is kind of irrelevant. The real topic is you have to accept the reality of authentication, which is that all authenticators are absolutely capable of making mistakes. It's an unfortunate fact, but it's a fact that everyone has to accept. I don't care if it's PSA or JSA or who it is. Every organization is capable of making a mistake. They're not infallible. And to expect them to be infallible, well, they should strive for it, but it's not necessarily going to happen. Should they make mistakes? No. But they have in the past, and it's going to happen again. What that means is there are autographs out there in collections that are fake, and the collector is not even aware of it. There's a good chance that I have an autograph that's not legit. And I'll take it even further. Maybe somebody's watching this video right now and saying, hey, I saw one of those baseballs and I don't think that autograph is legit. And they're typing it in the comments right now. Hey, thanks a lot. That's going to really make my day. But the thing is, no matter what, you've got to do your homework. You've got to do your research. You got to be as careful as you possibly can be. But no matter what, it's going to be a risk, no matter how you slice it. It's always going to be a risk. And once you accept that, once you sort of realize, look, all I can do is my best due diligence to lessen that risk, that's really all you can do. So just accept it, and you're going to sleep easier. But of course, this is much less of an issue most of the time, because most of the time you're not going to be collecting Mickey Mantle. You're not going to be collecting Ted Williams. You're going to be collecting big names, Hall of Fame names, star players, but not necessarily players whose autographs or the baseballs that they signed are demanding the big bucks. Forgers are much less likely to spend a lot of time on a baseball that's not going to, have a huge profit. All right, so you've got some baseballs. Now what are you going to do with them? Here's one simple rule to start with. Don't touch the baseball. Seriously, guys, do not touch the baseball with your bare hands. As someone who really gets into this, I highly recommend wearing gloves. Yeah, I get made fun of for wearing the gloves in my videos, and for some people it might seem like overkill. But hey, look at it this way. If you're spending a lot of money on some of these baseballs, you're going to want to protect your investment. At the very least, hold the baseball by the seams and don't touch the panels, and be really careful, because the oils on your fingers are guaranteed to damage the baseball over time if you don't handle it properly. Okay, so after handling the baseball, let's talk about storing the baseball. There are lots of different ways to store baseballs. Generally speaking, you're going to want to put it in a UV protected case. The UV cubes are fine. There are a lot of them out there, and you can get like bulk deals on them. They stack nicely. They display nicely. There are also more expensive stands with like little wooden mounts, and those are really cool, but they do take up a lot of space. So I only use them for a handful of the baseballs that I collect that are sort of the bigger parts of my collection. Now, with regards to the UV plastic cubes, there are some opinions out there that the plastic cubes are actually not a good idea for long-term storage, because the material used to make the baseball needs to breathe, and the cubes kind of close that off from happening. So it's better to either wrap the baseball in acid-free tissue, or at least put them in an acid-free box to allow them to breathe. And that's going to slow down the environmental damage that happens to the baseball over time. And that's recently something that I've switched over to. I used to have a lot of cubes, and I've kind of dropped a lot of the cubes, and I've switched over to the archival storage. And there are a lot of different archival websites out there with like museum quality boxes and stuff like that for preserving memorabilia and photographs and things like that. No matter how you store them, you definitely want to keep your baseballs out of light. Never, ever, ever put your baseballs in direct sunlight. In fact, it's best if you put them in a room where there's no sunlight at all. So if your baseball room has windows, I would encourage you to invest in blackout curtains, just to make sure that you don't have any sunlight coming into that room on a regular basis. And then also any light bulbs that you have in that room, change those light bulbs to a low wattage LED bulb. Basically, you want to keep that room dark, really dark as possible. And you also want to keep your room a consistent temperature, like 75 degrees and 50% humidity, and you want to avoid moisture. So yeah, don't put your baseballs in the attic, don't put your baseballs in the basement, because the next time you look those baseballs over, you're going to be heartbroken because they're going to be ruined. But here's the real kicker about all that advice. Even keeping the baseballs in a pitch black, temperature-controlled room for the rest of your life isn't going to stop the natural process of aging and toning. Some amount of toning and some amount of aging is going to happen to those baseballs over time, no matter what you do. All you can do is lessen the effects. So what's the mindset to have for this? I was in a Net54 forum recently, and somebody said this in a thread about autographed baseballs, and I thought it was just really well said, and I totally agree with them. They said, look, I take a Zen approach to collecting. You got to do what you can, but most importantly, just enjoy them. Okay, so that about wraps it up. Pretty lengthy, but I hope that was useful, both for those of you that have been collecting for a while or kind of, getting baseballs here and there, or for those of you that might be starting up a brand new collection and, you're just getting started. I definitely recommend it to anybody that's thinking about it. It is so much fun. I've never been as excited as I have been when I've gotten some of these signatures coming in, and I still love looking over at my collection and seeing some of the signatures that I have. It is a really rewarding hobby. You'll love it. Be careful, but enjoy it. If you do end up starting a collection, would love for you to share, post a link, or send me a message, hit me up. Love talking about autographed baseballs. So thanks for checking out the video, guys. Hope this was helpful. Take care. Talk to you all soon.